What's up? Welcome back to another video. My name's Michaela, aka Moe Kickz, and today I'll be showing you guys the long-awaited tutorial on how to use an airbrush on your custom shoes. So if that's something you're interested in, then keep on watching. Alright, so this is the setup I got going on in my studio. I have this portable spray booth that actually just collapses down and folds back up into a box, so that if you don't have room to keep it set up in your workspace, you can just pack it back up and set it aside and bring it out whenever you need to. I also have this Iwata air compressor that I recently got. When I first started out airbrushing, I bought this kit off of Amazon that came with the airbrush, any little tools it needed, and also a small compressor that just recently started giving me issues, so I upgraded to this Iwata one. This is actually a really great upgrade if you plan on using your airbrush for the majority of your projects. This compressor actually allows you to hook up 2 airbrushes, which is great for projects that you plan on doing like an ombre gradient effect. Whichever compressor or airbrush that you decide to go with, it will have a manual to tell you how to set your compressor up so that you have the correct amount of pressure for the type of projects that you'll be working on. For smaller projects like custom shoes, setting it at a 40 psi is what works best for me. If you want to play around with the different pressures between 40 and 60, that's up to you, but again, 40 works well for me. So one of the things I highly recommend you getting if you're going to be airbrushing is one of these cleaning pots. Not only does it hold your airbrush for you if you need to set it down in between sprays, but when you're cleaning out your airbrush, instead of just blowing out the cleaner into the air or into a rag or whatever, you can just blow it into the cleaning pot and it'll collect it for you, and obviously once it's filled you can dispose of it. As for the airbrush, I use this Pichet Talon airbrush, which again I bought in a kit. The kit came with the airbrush, the hose you needed, as well as a compressor, which lasted me a good 3.5 years before it started to give me issues. So if you're a beginner, I do highly recommend getting that kit because it is a really good price. So this right here that I'm showing you is an attachment that doesn't come with the kit, but the purpose of it is to collect any moisture in the air. Now your compressor should come with one of these type of traps already, but when I was using my last compressor, it just wasn't doing the job and moisture was coming out of my airbrush and onto my project, so I was given one of these moisture traps that really helped collect any moisture that was in the air. Now that I've shown you the basic tools that you'll need for airbrushing, I'm going to go in and show you how I airbrush my shoes. So a tip I'm going to give you guys is that if you're changing a part of your shoe that is black or just a dark color and you want to lighten it up to white or a light color like yellow or something like that, instead of just going in with straight white to cover it up, go in with a light gray. I like to use the color Mist by Angelus Direct. Go in with about 2 coats of that to lighten up the dark areas. And then you can go in with white or whatever light color you plan on going with. Because the consistency of some of these lighter shades are really thin, so you're going to end up using way more coats than you want to. And the thicker your paint is, the more likely it is to crack and peel. So now what I'm doing is thinning out this paint just a little bit because the consistency of it is kind of thicker than some of the other shades of Angelus paints. So when running paint through an airbrush, you don't want it to be too thick because then the paint can start to clog up the tip and your paint will start to spray out unevenly and kind of mess up your project. So based on the directions here on this too thin bottle, it says to mix 4 parts paint and 1 part too thin, which basically means that you want more paint than you want too thin. If you add too much and your paint is just extremely thin, it's going to affect the way it adheres to your shoe, and your paint could end up cracking or peeling once the shoe creases. So you want to make sure that you mix the too thin and the paint thoroughly, and then when pouring it into your airbrush, instead of pouring it directly into the cup, you want to filter it. That way it catches any chunks of paint that might have been in your mixture. This is just an extra step you can take in order to prevent your airbrush from clogging, because once it clogs in the middle of working on your project, now you got to stop everything that you're doing to try to clear it up and fix it. Otherwise your paint is just not going to spray on smoothly. All of the tools and products that I'm using in this video will be linked down in the description down below in case you're interested in getting them for yourself. So now it's time to show you how the actual airbrush works. Majority of them are pretty much the same. When you push the trigger down, it'll release air, as you can hear. But then when you push the trigger down and pull back is how you release paint. The further you pull the trigger back, the more paint will be released. So this little knob on the back here is what helps you adjust the amount of paint that comes out. So as you can see here, I tightened it and the trigger barely moves, which means pretty much no paint will come out. If you just loosen it up a little bit, which is usually where I like to keep it, you can basically pull the trigger all the way back and it'll release a good amount of paint, nothing too thick. But if you loosen the back up a little bit more, as you can see, a lot more paint comes out and it'll come out a little bit too thick and most likely start to drip, which you don't want to do on your shoes. You want to make sure that you have nice thin coats and that you're able to control the amount of paint that's coming out. So if you're not too good at controlling how far back you pull the trigger, just adjust that knob on the back and pull it back far in practice and see, what's a good amount of paint that's coming out for you. I've been doing this for a few years now, so I'm pretty good at being able to control how far I pull the trigger back, whether I have the knob on the back adjusted or not. So now it's finally time to start painting the shoe. Again, I'm going in with the color Mist by Angelus Direct, and I'm going to do about 2 coats of these before I go in with their white. I'm going to be laying stencils on top of this, so I'm going to make sure that these coats are very thin and I allow enough time for them to dry in between coats, because if you paint it on too thick and don't allow it to dry, once you go off and peel off those stencils, it might take the paint off with it. As I've mentioned in previous videos, you definitely want to make sure you paint those edges. It just makes it look much more professional in the end. And on a side note, I apologize for these terrible angles. I am left-handed and I should have thought of placing my camera on my right side so that you could see what I was doing. At the time, I wasn't realizing that my hand would be in the way of the camera, so for next time I would definitely switch up the angles. So here I'm noticing that my paint isn't coming out the way I wanted it to and it's starting to clog. It's not because there's chunks of paint in the way. I think it's just that my paint's a little thick so that when it's coming out the nozzle, the air that's coming out is kind of drying the paint up on the tip of the needle. So if this ever happens to you, just screw off that first part that I'm screwing back on now and wet your paper towel with some airbrush cleaner and wipe the tip of the needle clean and you should be good to go. So once that first layer has dried for about maybe 10 minutes, you want to go in with your second coat. Again, another thin layer. And as you can see, it's a big difference between 2 coats of that light gray on the left side and 1 coat on the right. So now I'm going to be going in with white, and in order to do that, I like to clean out most of the previous paint that I used before adding in that second color. So I just wipe out any excess paint with a paper towel or a Q-tip, and then I pour in just a little bit of airbrush cleaner. You don't need to fill up the entire cup, you just put in a little bit and then cover the tip like I'm doing here and pull down and back on the trigger as if you're spraying out paint, and you'll see these bubbles coming up. This just helps the cleaner filter through the tip of the airbrush and hopefully clean out any of that excess paint. So once you let it bubble just a little bit, then you can take your cleaning pot and spray out any of that airbrush cleaner and basically repeat those same steps until you feel like it's no longer spraying out that previous color. Now I'm going to go in with white. And because this is a brand new bottle, there should be no reason why there's any dried chunks of paint in there, so I'm not going to filter it. I always like to spray just a little bit out to make sure there's no airbrush cleaner mixed in with that paint. Again, we're going in with thin coats and then drying them in between layers. And here is the difference between 2 coats of gray and 1 coat of white on the left shoe and just those 2 coats of gray on the right shoe. I believe I went in with another coat of white off camera just to make sure that the white was very solid, but that one coat would have been just fine as well. Now when you're done with your airbrush, you want to go through that same cleaning process that I showed you before. Wiping it out with a paper towel and Q-tip, filtering some cleaner through it until you're no longer seeing any paint come out. But because I'm completely finished with it for the moment, there are a few extra steps to deep clean it just to make sure paint doesn't dry in your airbrush. So most airbrushes are pretty much the same. You're going to want to screw off that back piece and loosen up that screw that locks the needle in place. Then you're going to want to carefully clean the needle. You want to make sure that you do not drop or bend this needle, because once you bend that tip, your paint is no longer coming out smooth. It's going to splatter and spray all over the place, and you're going to have to invest in some new needles. Once you clean your needles, set it aside, and now unscrew the tip. This specific airbrush came with a little tool that helps you unscrew the tip, because you do need to screw it on very tightly so that no air sneaks out from the sides. So once you got it off, then you want to go in with the Q-tip and then clean up those insides. If you don't do this after every use, that paint is going to sit there and build up and dry, and it's going to be harder and harder to unscrew the tip and clean it out. You're going to have to let it soak for a while, and it's just easier to get in the habit of cleaning it up after every use. Now when cleaning out the tip, I like to use these really pointy Q-tips to get in there. And if you had any issues with clogging or anything like that, it's most likely because there's chunks of paint that's stuck in the tip. So you want to look through it, see if there's anything in there, and then go in with these little tip cleaners. Again, I'll link everything down below in the description. But there's these tip cleaners, which are these like little metal wires that come with a bunch of different sizes. I usually just go with the thinnest one. And you just want to poke out any of those little paint chunks that were probably causing you issues. Next thing I do is go in with those pointy Q-tips, and I don't force them through the airbrush because they're not thin enough to go through the entire thing, but I just put them in there enough to collect some of that extra paint that's hiding in there. And I do that until basically the Q-tips are coming out a little more clean. Once I feel like I got most of that paint out, I'll then go in with these brush cleaners that came in the airbrush kit, and I'll run these through the airbrush and just kind of like scrub it in there to pull out as much paint as possible. And I repeat that same step over and over until there's no more paint coming out. When I think I've gotten all the paint out with that brush, I like to go in and put the needle through the airbrush and then take it back out and wipe it on my glove to see if there's any more paint left in there. And as you can see, we're all clear, so I'm going to start putting the airbrush back together. I took the trigger out earlier when I was cleaning it, so now I'm just trying to put it back in there. There's this little knob in there that you want to make sure the trigger is touching, and to make sure that you've put it in there correctly, just press down, pull back, make sure some air is coming out when you do that, and that's how you know you've got it in there correctly. So now I'm going to screw on the tip and put the needle back in. The last thing you want to do is if you have any of those moisture traps, you want to release any of the moisture that was built up in there, because if you let it sit, it will start to build up some kind of residue, and you don't want to do that. So I do have a few other tutorials that show you how to make stencils with your Cricut, as well as place them onto your shoe. So if you need to learn how to do that, I will link those down below and you can check them out. As you can see, after I laid my stencils, I went in and airbrushed with the color. I believe I did about 2 to 3 more coats of that to make sure it was nice and solid. And then this is the final product. If you're interested in getting any custom shoes made by me, make sure you check out my website and fill out the request form, which is linked down below in the description, and I'll reach out by email. As always, if you have any questions, make sure you leave a comment down below and I'll try my best to answer them. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on your post notifications to make sure you're notified every time I post a new video.